Staff, so thank you very much for that introduction. So my name is Nadia and I will be hosting the evening today, and I am honoured to be the host of this event at this brilliant bookshop, Housemans. Who's not been here before? Hands up. Great, some new people in Housemans, fantastic. So really happy to be hosting this with the brilliant Hazel today. How this is going to work is we're going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then after that we want to open it to questions and a nice conversation and a chat. And as we said, Hazel will be happy to sign copies of her book afterwards. So before we go on to this event, just to say, in case you have friends and family and comrades, Southampton, Edinburgh, Sheffield, and then London again, and then hopefully Bristol and Totnes, is that right, Hazel? So Google basically, or search with another search engine, I should say, Hazel's name, and with those locations to find out those events, and please pass them on to people as well. So without further ado, Hazel already has been introduced, but I should say that she has been mapping alternative economies in the UK, culminating in this brilliant book, Frontierlands, Britain's Survival in the Making. So again, please join me in welcoming Hazel. So let's start with something big, if everyone's all right with that. So when I read this book, I felt that Frontierlands is kind of not just an important book because it's cataloguing real-life stories of ingenuity and creativity and the resilience in the face of this ever-increasing corporate greed that we're all seeing, but also institutional failures. But it strikes me also as an important intervention ideologically and politically, suggesting a kind of new thesis on how we would see the world. So I happen to be reading this other book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, by the brilliant anthropologist Anna Tsing, and she proposes this idea of third nature, where you've got this idea that first nature is kind of the ecological reality of which humans is part over here, and then second nature is when capitalism kind of intervenes and screws everything up. But she comes up with this idea of third nature, which is about what manages to thrive despite capitalism. And it seems to me that Frontierland is not just a book that is about these, positive stories, which we're going to delve into and talk about, but also it's pointing to what I would call a kind of polyphony or an anti-linear reading of our potential futures and how we can thrive and survive in the ruins of capitalism. So let's start with big, and then we'll go specific. So I'd like to ask you to start by asking, does any of that framing resonate as a kind of meta theory of Frontierlands?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Nadia. I can sort of see you through this spotlight. And thank you all for coming. There were many times when I thought I'd never be sitting here talking about my book in front of other people, so I'm kind of pinching myself that it's real and it's here.
It's definitely real.
Like many people, I dreamed of writing a book since I was a kid, but I didn't realise that writing this book would teach me how to be in the world. When I signed my publishing contract in 2022, I just had my first son, a little boy called Stanley, and when I finished the book, the edits in September, I just had my second son, baby Larry. And for many years, I'd been consumed with anxieties about how to live in the world, how to raise my children and work at the same time, how to work in a way that doesn't do harm. The world is becoming increasingly frightening for all of us. I don't think I'm the only one to live with those questions. And I was looking for a compass. And over the last 10 years of researching and writing this book, it has been my absolute privilege to meet countless people who are engaged every day in the question of how to live and how to engage with this world, how to be head on. I met one of them not far from here. He's just crept in, I think, Len Maloney. Good timing, Len. Len is sitting at the back, he is a car mechanic, and he works in a garage, or did work in a garage not far from Haggerston Station, just down the way from Haggerston Station. And when I met him in 2018, his landlord, Transport for London, was trying to evict him from his arch. Len is a pillar of his community. He has served generations of the same family, and he has welcomed hundreds of kids, boys mostly, black young men, through his doors to work as apprentices and to do work experience. Just by being there, he shows young people that there is something they can do outside of school, outside of influencer culture or whatever. And I will never forget that day that I met him. He walked me round this block of railway arches, and loads of them were closed. They were shuttered from when his friends and his neighbours had all been evicted. And eventually we came to one that was still open, and there was a man there called Hassan Enver. Sorry, this always makes me emotional. Hassan was a Turkish, or still is a Turkish taxi mechanic, and he had been evicted from his original arch and was in this tiny space, just not even really big enough for a single car. And he told us that his business partner had taken his own life because of the pressure from the landlord over the rising rent and the struggle to keep his business afloat. Last year, Len was also evicted after 7 years of battling really bravely to stay in that arch. But his work has only got more powerful, and today he is a founding member of the London Trades Guild Community Land Trust. This is an organisation that only last week elected its board, and they are fighting for affordable workspaces for local businesses in London. And they are battling with GLA and TfL and different mayors to find this space so that people like Len, people whose businesses really contribute to our communities, can stay in London. Please go and talk to him. He's the most amazing person.
And if that's all right with you and with Len, we are going to delve into this story a little bit more later. And we're really grateful that you're here to join us, Len.
Thank you.
I know that this is really emotional for you, specifically this story of London and all the stories really in the book. But I guess, we can introduce you in this technical way. You've done this 10 years of research, but really what I'd like to hear is about the story of how you came to this book. You've just given us a really emotive vignette, and I'm sure everyone has similar feelings. But how did this book come about? Like, why this book? What's the story of it?
I think it really is that looking for that compass, living in that uncertain world, bringing children into a world which felt completely like it was on fire, and not knowing how to live or what to do about that. And I mean, the story of the farneera.org, this search for alternative economy, started when I was a business editor at The Independent. Some of my independent colleagues are at the back there. We all made our way out of that organisation eventually, and we still talk about it to this day. But my own escape hatch was after Brexit. I was there during the referendum, and I was the business editor, and we were there at like 4:30 in the morning, 5 in the morning, watching this Leave vote roll in. And it was just so blindingly obvious to me at that moment that we, in these newsrooms in the centre of London, just had absolutely no idea what was going on around the country. Like, markets didn't predict this, newspapers didn't know this was going to happen. And just right there and then I was like, what am I doing here? Like, no, this is not the place where real things are happening. And I was very lucky to win some money from the Friends of Provident Foundation. I won a grant. I proposed to them I would map alternative economies, and I started travelling around the country in search of these alternatives. And one of the places I ended up in was in Hastings. Another young man I met there was a man called Darren French. And when I met him, he had pink hair, and he was working in his housing estate in one of the poorest parts of Hastings. He was trying to build community housing on this condemned land. It was a former power station. It was like this really bottom of a valley, toxic ground, and this community organisation were trying to gain the right to this land to build housing, affordable housing for people like Darren. Darren couldn't even walk at that time. He couldn't work because he'd been told by the doctors he had some terrible syndrome, and he couldn't walk, so he had a stick. Watchet. And his engagement with this work through this organisation, I mean, it changed his life. He not only was able to find work that felt meaningful to him on his doorstep, but eventually he started to walk again. And the doctors told him, they couldn't actually find any evidence of the syndrome. And so it completely changed his life. And that, like so many of the stories in the book, was one of the initiatives that failed. Owning land, getting land out of private ownership is really hard. But even as that project was failing, the organisation was working to secure empty buildings in the centre of Hastings, in what became the Hastings Commons, which today is, thousands of square metres of formerly derelict space in the centre of the town, which is now in community ownership. And these are beautiful, transformed buildings. I work in the co-working space in one of them. I've been to a wedding on the roof of one of the old factories. I had my book launch last month in the basement.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the buildings for a minute, if that's all right with you. Because, I mean, I wish it wasn't the case, but often covers sell books. And I love the cover of this book. And it is so kind of enticing, this landscape with a building on it, a derelict building. And so, we're going to talk about Hastings Commons and, various different collectives. But before we get into the people, which are the important part of the story, I'd love to hear your perspective on why are we so drawn to, and in a way people are obsessed with, I think, a lot of people are obsessed with derelict buildings. Like, why do they draw us in? I'd love to hear your perspective on that. I mean, I don't know, people who are on, social media and stuff, there's all of these groups of people who do urban exploring and kind of break into derelict buildings. And people are obsessed with this sort of stuff. And I wondered, with your experience, with all of these different buildings, like, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, thank you, Nadia. I mean, I think it's got something to do with nostalgia, right? Nostalgia, I mean, it literally means like a longing to return home. I also think of the German word Heimweh, which translates as homesickness, but it's a bit more than that. It's like a craving for safety or comfort. And I think when we see these buildings, it's kind of a longing for place, maybe, like what they used to be. But also I think it's about a longing for a different time. I think we live in a moment where time is kind of eating itself. Like it feels like, we hear about the end of history, and actually the end of the world, it feels kind of close right now. And I think when, the right understands that in this moment, that nostalgia is a very powerful political idea. But I think what my book is trying to explore is the cyclical nature of time, and this idea that progress or growth, or whatever you want to call it, is actually, it's not linear. And I think these old buildings, they remind us that actually many worlds have already ended. Like if the coal mines in Wales, that world has ended. The clay mines in Cornwall, that world has ended. The metalworks in the Midlands, these are all worlds that have ended. And I think of these derelict buildings, I say this in the book, as a kind of a dialect or a vernacular, a language that we once knew how to speak. And actually, I think what I'm trying to do in the book is to show people that we can remember that dialect. We do still know how to speak that language. And we know how to make things. We know how to connect with the ground beneath us and how to live more in harmony with our environment. And that interconnectedness and reviving that knowledge is going to become really essential as we face more interruptions with climate change, as supply chains break down, and we have to look much closer to home to sustain ourselves. And I think that's why I'm so interested in the reinvention of these places and what they can tell us about the future. And
the permanence. There's something there of like these structures that have been left, like you said, and exist from another time. But how can we repurpose effectively? And about the waste as well, right? There's something there about the waste, and they're just left, and the imagery around that. So let's go back to Hastings, where you currently live. And in the book, there's a quote from Jess from Hastings Commons, who talks about outpricing on the open market, and basically says this is the modern form of the enclosures. And since one of the themes, as you mentioned, of this book is about communities trying to take back like physical space and land from from capital. Maybe in terms of like examples, we can start by you telling us a little bit about the significance of that statement and kind of what Jess was saying there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think many of you will know that about the enclosures, right? That England used to be full of common land, which was stewarded in common, that people, anybody had the right to graze cattle and to collect firewood from this land. And in 1500, actually half of England and Wales was common land. And then slowly, through actually many centuries, this land was enclosed. So it was kind of fenced off. And this process was formalised through Acts of Parliament, and gradually it removed the rights of ordinary people to graze cattle and to use this land. So everything becomes fenced and taxed and owned and controlled. And there's an incredible academic called Silvia Federici, who has done some very interesting work,
great work
around the idea that actually the people who used this land, the people who benefited the most were often older women or people who couldn't work or weren't able to work. And that when this land was enclosed, they were kind of dispossessed of this right. And older women especially then had to start knocking on doors and begging essentially for firewood and food. And actually it's at the same time that we see the emergence of this idea that old women were witches, and that if you refused them this help, then they would put a hex on your family. So we see that actually it's not just about land, the enclosures, it's also about a kind of enclosure of the mind. And, you know, people no longer think stewarded land is normal, like that we can share land in common. You know, if you think of a commune, it's now kind of this kind of weird cultish thing. We're less familiar with that as an idea. So Jess Steele is a commoner at large, she calls herself, in Hastings. She's the kind of driving force behind the Hastings Commons, these buildings I was telling you about. And she says that, as Nadia just said, that outpricing on the open market is this modern form of enclosure. And that's because she thinks these derelict buildings are common pool resources. And actually, many of them these days are. You know, with the council selling off assets, a lot of empty buildings or places that used to be used by people in their neighbourhoods are no longer available to them. So, you know, libraries, sports centres, community centres, daycare centres. I mean, you know, we know the council asset sell-off is a thing, and that these were publicly owned buildings, that we all owned them through our taxes and through our local councils. And the open market, when these assets hit the open market, you know, that's not a level playing field. Like, it only takes into account the financial value of that building. It doesn't take into account the social value or the history of it or the cultural value of it. So we have to ask the question, like, what is the extension of the enclosures in this way doing to our minds today? And who is losing out? And I think it's still the people who benefited most from public spaces: children, young people, old people, immigrants, differently abled people. You know, we're saying there's no place for you anymore. And I think that goes some way to fueling fear of the other in our communities, and ultimately a political swing to the right. And actually, I was doing work for The Guardian recently around derelict buildings on high streets. And we know statistically that in places where there are more derelict high street buildings, people are more likely to vote reform. It's statistically, you know, it checks out. So, yeah, I think that's what she means.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And yeah, I think I love the story and how you talk about it and bring the whole thread together of just people standing outside this building and seeing it going from hand to hand to hand, but with absolutely no use to it. So not thinking at all about the community utility is at no part of the story, and it requires like such an amount of energy. That's the thing that comes for me, that was really a thread through this book for me, like the amount of energy that people are putting in to get to the point of something that should be understood as normal, but also kind of how quickly we came to that idea of normal, that, you know, that public utility and public ownership is not really a thing, or like commons is a thing. So potentially how quickly it could be reversed, right?
Absolutely.
So let's go now to Watchet in West Somerset. Apologies, my pronunciation of words that I've not said before is not very good. So Watchet in West Somerset. you've got the Onion Collective there, is that right?
Yes.
Like, brilliant what they do. This quote kind of stood out for me, this idea, and I know that you had like an alternative view to this, but like one of the Onion Collective, one of the women was saying about Watchet that it was left alone, not left behind. And that's kind of their into understanding how they kind of shape the landscape. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what the scenario was down there.
Thank you. Yeah, Watchet is this amazing place. It's in West Somerset, and it's literally like known as like one of the most isolated towns in England. So I started off with this grant funding, and I wanted to visit economic alternatives. And somebody told me about these women, 5 women, all of them had worked away in London, some in really high-powered jobs, and they'd all returned to this tiny, like, seaside town to raise their children. And they decided they were going to build a multi-million-pound art gallery on a quayside that was essentially just covered in mud. I mean,
Which is brilliant.
I mean, it was.
They were just like, we're going to do this, and everyone was like, "You're nuts."
Yeah.
And they were like, "No, we're going to do it," which is great.
Yeah,
right? That's how it starts.
I mean, obviously, I like had to go there, and the opening of the book is me trying to get to this place. You know, with everything has moved inland. Like the harbour, working harbour closed down. The paper factory disappeared. The local council became like a regional council, became an authority. There's no way to get there. The trains don't work. So I'm on this like tiny single-decker bus that like down these tiny roads. So it's a mission just to get there. But and you know that many people, you know, that was this idea that they've been kind of left behind. You know, they did have really, they still do have really horrific statistical outcomes. You know, they had lowest wages in the country at one point. It was one of the lowest productivities for small and medium enterprises in the country. Young people found it really hard just to get to school and to college, you know, on these tiny buses. Like, it's very difficult just to get the education they needed there. And yet they had built this amazing art gallery as an ambitious kind of gathering place for people living on the edge. And a lot of the work that they do there is about, it's not about art. We think of the art world, you know, and art as a commodity traded for lots of money, but actually the kind of art gallery this is a place where people are making whole worlds with their art. You know, they are people who are pushing at the boundaries of our consciousness to help us to figure out a way through the impending catastrophe, right? It's the most incredible place. And Jess has this idea that they've not been left behind, but they've been left alone. And I think actually that can almost sound a bit naive, you know, fine, they've managed to raise all this money, incredible people, they've made this art gallery. But the more I think about it, the more I just think she's right. And I was reading just the other day, there's a new book out by an academic called John Rapley. His book's called Icarus Economics, and he is exploring this idea that rich, wealthy countries like Britain are actually worse placed than countries in the global south to deal with climate change because we don't have any resilience anymore. You know, we've outsourced absolutely everything. And so in parts of Britain that are historically, they've had less, or they are less developed, if you like, people are actually much more resourceful. We see this, and I document this in the book during the pandemic, of course. It was the first time many of the organisations doing this work, in very deep neighbourhood work, in very places with many, many different challenges, they really came to the fore. So, you know, at that moment, everything drops away. And it's the places where people trust their neighbours, places where there are like flourishing mutual aid groups and neighbourhood support groups that really did better than places, for example, in London, you know, where all the businesses shut their doors and there weren't so many public places to gather. So I think that has real weight, this idea of being left behind. And I draw also on this. She actually calls herself a disaster preparedness expert. She's an amazing woman called Lucy Easthope. And she literally works in the aftermath of disasters, so Grenfell or terrible flooding disasters, 7/7 bombings. She's the person that the government calls on and is like, how do we deal with these things? And she has this idea of lifescapes, that in this moment where everything's gone to shit, people need places to gather. They need their local church, they need their library, they need their mosque, they need places where they can be together to figure out how to move forwards. Those are our frontier lands, like those are our community buildings that need to be in ownership of the community so that people can gather there.
Yeah, and that's what's so brilliant, I think, about the book, is that you get to read about these stories of how it actually happens, not just, the end point, but how people came up with the idea and how, the definite struggles to make things happen, and they're not always successful, but in a way it does give you, I don't really like the word hope. I want to talk about something bigger than that, but it's an example of that kind of resilience, I think, as we're saying right at the beginning, of like how human beings are coping and actually what is quite a difficult situation. So yeah, thank you for bringing all these stories to us. The Onion Collective are brilliant, and it's like worth buying the book just to read about them alone. So I think now it's time to move back to London. Shall we move back to London and the storytelling? Okay. So we're going to come back to the story that you were talking about in the beginning, about the arches under the railway bridges, which for those of us who live in London, we all see them. And I think with this chapter specifically, I think you did such a great job of kind of political education on how business is conducted. I'm very involved in politics and I knew nothing about this. And, you gave us an idea about it in the beginning. So I wonder if you would like to embellish what you started talking about earlier, which is not just Len's story, hello Len at the back, but also kind of tell us who owns these things, what's the involvement of TfL, why do they buy and leave and rot, and why are they making it so difficult for people? And yeah, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, TfL and also National Rail. National Rail, until it sold its business portfolio, was the largest landlord of small businesses in the whole country. And that's because they own the viaducts and the infrastructure for trains, right? And lots of small businesses in arches and in bits of land adjacent to train stations. This was the pockets of land where small businesses historically found a home. National Rail sold their portfolio to Blackstone, one of the largest private equity companies in the world, and they formed a company called Archco. And of course, they acted like any private investor would do and immediately jacked up rents and made it very difficult for many of these people to keep their premises.
But we're talking 3 times the rent, or for just overnight.
So this is the shocking thing. Right? That's not Len's landlord.
Okay.
Len's landlord is Transport for London,
right?
Now Places for London,
okay,
a publicly owned entity, who has nonetheless, I think Len will agree, over the years acted with just as much of a profit motive as National Rail, well, as the former National Rail, as Blackstone did when it acquired these railway arches from National Rail. That is the shocking thing to me, really. This is still, they've created Places for London as a business entity to own these properties, but they're acting as a commercial landlord. Of course, we understand that these people have to make money in order to keep our transport services running in London, but they are part of the infrastructure of our societies, and they also have a duty to make these places livable. Len's business, his garage, was a part of the fabric of his community. It's where you take your car to get it fixed. It's where you send your child for their work experience. These are not nice to have services. These are essential parts of our towns and cities. Len's Arch, nearly a year and a half since he was eventually evicted, is still empty. And Len is still campaigning to get back in the arch. And in the meantime, doing this pioneering work to find land that can be owned by the community through, I think we'll talk about these various entities in which communities can buy out land and own it for other businesses in his position who will be in his position again. And that is enormously difficult in a place like London.
Yeah, maybe you can take us to like the detail about asset stripping and how it works, and then we can talk about the community land trust, if that's all right. So like how does this work? What's happening effectively?
I've been thinking about this a lot lately with regards to the council funding crisis and councils selling off assets. And I have a friend called Frances who works at the New Economics Foundation, and she's the one that said, this is asset stripping. We think of asset stripping as something that private investors do. They buy a business and then they just sell off anything that's worth anything. and then they just, you know, like sell it on. But actually, this is what's happening by local councils. They are stripping us, the people, of assets in, you know, in all over the country. And the latest research, I mean, I did an investigation way back in 2018 with the Bureau Local, part of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and we, a brilliant journalist called Gareth Davies, FOI'd all of the councils in the whole country to figure out what councils have been selling. And we worked with a developer to make a searchable map of the country, and you could literally put in your postcode or your street and you could see what your council had sold all around you. And that was, it was like, I think it was 2014 to 2018 we did at the time. Now Frances at Neff has just been updating this for the last 6 or 7 years. She hasn't done the whole country, but she's done like key parts of the country. And this sell-off has only increased. And what's really shocking is that in the poorest places, more buildings are being sold. Like these places are being asset stripped quicker. And another thing I think is really like astounding is that the money that the councils get from this process, they're not allowed to use, it's illegal to use that to fund the day-to-day, basically. So it's kind of ring-fenced money. So they haven't spent it. They've got all this money from capital receipts and they're just kind of sitting on it because councils don't actually have the resources these days. They don't have the staff, essentially, to figure out what to do with all that money. And, you know, the work that NAF is doing is around, you know, there are mechanisms that we'll talk about shortly which allow communities to acquire these buildings. The problem is, a bit like with David Cameron's Big Society, if they've got all these buildings and they've got no funding, there's no like legal support, like institutional infrastructure to like help them run it, then you're just, I mean, you're on a hiding to nothing, right? You need some funding to go along with it. So Frances is doing this pioneering piece of work around what if this money that the councils can't spend could be a pot of funding that communities could bid on, and they could not only get some, you know, institutional support from local authorities, but also the money to keep these assets going for the good of the community.
Yeah, and what you need is people in jobs who are paid to do that research and do that work, exactly. Because, you know, the government's not doing it, or not interested in doing it anytime soon, it looks like. So let's move from that to, okay, what are some of the pieces of infrastructure or methodologies, or what do people have to be able to, in a way, either fight back or kind of gain literally some land back from capital? So one of them is a community land trust, but also there are some other ones. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what tools we could have.
Yes, I mean,
and what some people use in your book.
Yes, you could get really technical on this, which I won't, but I think the main mechanism that's worth talking about is something called an asset of community value. It's an ACV. And this is a mechanism by which anyone, you, can register an at-risk building in your community, a library that you love, a pub that might be about to be closed down, a community centre where you send your kids, as an asset of community value. It's a legal structure. You have to do it, you have to write to your local authority. There's a whole bunch of forms to fill in. But once you've done it, then it does, and if you get granted status, which is another hurdle, it goes on a list, and every local council has a list of assets of community value. And that means that if the building ever goes up for sale, the community has a right, originally just to bid on that asset, but upgraded right now since the devolution bill of 2024-25 to buy the asset. And what that means in practice is that a community organisation, there's a moratorium on the sale for 6 months, which supposedly gives a community organisation enough time to raise the money to buy a building that they consider of value in their community. Of course, I mean, this is, you know, it's almost negligible, the numbers of buildings that actually get acquired by communities through this mechanism, because no community, I mean, very few communities are able to raise sometimes millions in funding to acquire one of these buildings within 6 months. You know, that's an astounding expectation. And actually the work that Frances is doing is, I mean, it's staggering how few make it into community hands, maybe 1 to 3% of assets of community value. So yes, Frances and New Economics Foundation are calling for a complete moratorium on the sale of publicly owned buildings and a complete rethinking of how we get these assets into community hands, because that right is not going far enough.
Yeah, and the example that we have from Wales, there's also like, what are they doing around the woods there? Because there was a whole different set of steps that people were having to take.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to add on that, which is kind of different to cities, isn't it?
It's totally different, yeah. So in Wales, I spent a lot of time in the South Wales valleys with a community in a town called Treherbert who were essentially trying to acquire right to co-manage their land. This is like former coal mining town and recently hit with terrible flooding because of climate change. I'm sure you all remember the flooding in Wales a few years ago. Basically, a group of these people, this amazing man called Chris Blake, won some money to take a bunch of people from the South Wales valleys to Scotland, and they visited a croft. And I'm sure you know that in Scotland they have these crofters' rights, which mean that you can essentially own pieces of land. You have crofters' rights that are kind of a tenant's rights, but in perpetuity. So you can pass a piece of land on to your children and your grandchildren after that, like tenancies hundreds of years long. Which gives people, people feel like the land belongs to them. They really steward it and they have this relationship with it. And of course, nothing like that exists in England and Wales. So Chris Blake was asking the question, like, how can we get like crofters' rights in England, or how can we get something as good as that in the South Wales valleys? And they did it. They don't own the land, but they worked with Natural Resources Wales, which is the kind of public body that owns that basically manages the land in Wales.
I mean, blood from a stone, that story of like trying to get things to move, but they did it. In the end, it was like you're reading it and you're like, please make this work.
I know, yeah. They had like this co-design process, 12 sessions. They got these people from the authorities to like come with them, go on walks through the forest. They like just really held these public bodies to account and basically won the right to co-steward a part of the forest in South Wales. Which means that now, basically what the public body is doing at the minute is felling all the trees, and they are felling them, like clear felling them, because these forests are so overgrown. They're supposed to be like thinned every 20 years. Some of them are like 60, 70 years old. So the authorities are like, can't do anything here, cut it all down. But if you're like somebody living in the South Wales valleys, that's where you walk your dog. That's where you go biking and you go hiking. They don't want to see these forests just cleared. So what they've done is through this co-design process, they've brokered a deal with the local authorities where, sure, they're going to have to clear fell some of the sides of these valleys, but in the future, everything will be thinned. They're going to be planting more native species. At the moment, it's all larch. It's like a monocrop of larch, and they're planning a nature reserve, a timber processing plant, so that they can't profit from the timber because they don't own the land, so it's not as good as crofters' rights in that regard, but they can use the timber. At the moment it gets clear felled, it gets sent to an incinerator to be burned as biomass. But they've got the right now to use the timber. They want to build affordable housing, desperately needed in the South Wales valleys. They're teaching people how to forestry skills, basically, and they've gone into partnership with an education, a new kind of education institution called Black Mountains. Incredible place, Black Mountains College. And they are essentially equipping young people with skills to survive the apocalypse. I mean, that sounds crazy, but it's kind of what we need, right? These are young people who are learning like real forestry skills, like how to build houses out of local timber, permaculture, agriculture. And actually, a lot of the places in the book are thinking about that education piece. We have the language, we have the skills in our communities, but Len is living proof that we're fighting tooth and nail to keep them there. And actually, what we really need is education, and to bring this back to educate more young people how to survive when crisis comes.
Yeah, and also I think I hope this book is the beginning of telling these stories and capturing them somewhere, because great stuff is happening, but that narrative is not being held anywhere. And I really, really hope that this book is inspires some kind of platform or movement where we can all kind of share all of those different things that are happening. So we started the book. We started this talk talking about what is going to thrive and strive despite capitalism. And I wonder if you wanted to maybe end before we open to questions. I'm sure people want to have all sorts of things they want to ask, and we can have a nice discussion. But whether you wanted to say something about the spirit of abundance, which was something that you were talking to me about recently.
Yeah, I was reading this book, Hospicing Modernity. I don't know if anyone's read that. Yeah, it's quite confronting. Basically about how everything has to change. I think, we are. I still, how is it possible to get through the day without feeling acute despair about the state of the world and like where we're all heading? But I do feel hopeful. I mean, I just know that we kind of know the way forward. There's no longer a question to me like, how do we survive when all the supply chains shut down? It's like, actually, we do know how to do it, and these people are doing it already in places that have basically been coping with disaster for longer than most of us can bear to think about it. Like just living in one of these towns can be considered, extreme, like an extreme way of life sometimes. And so they kind of have figured that out for us. I just think we need to learn from them, like you said, Nadia. Like we need these ideas to come into the mainstream.
Yeah, and this preoccupation with the newness was something else that you mentioned. And what perhaps some of these buildings and sites teach us is that our ability to be innovators as human beings and kind of make something new out of the shell of, I guess, something old. And that's something that's really going to stay with me. But thank you so much for writing this book. So can we give you a round of applause before we go on to questions?
Thank you.
It's such a good story. I hope everyone's going to buy this book. But we now have time for questions and chat. So any questions?